So what on earth is going on and why now? This week we had an explosive UFO hearing in the House Oversight Committee featuring 3 former government officials with allegations of experiences with non-human spacecraft. This hearing was the 3rd UFO hearing in the last 2 years, with the first of which taking place in May of 2022 in the House Intel Committee, and the second UFO hearing taking place this April 2023 in the Senate Armed Services Committee. In the first 2 parts of this series, we cover the origin story for how we started the path towards these 3 historic hearings in Congress. It all started in 2008 with the creation of the Advanced Aerospace Weapons Systems Applications Program by the late Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid. This program would evolve into ATIP, the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, which would then be exposed in a 2017 New York Times article. I also laid out the foundation for my theory of the case, which is that what we are seeing transpire right now is a constitutional struggle between the legislative branch and the executive branch over who has authority over UFO materials. We left off in the summer of 2021, where we saw the first report released by the Unidentified Aerial Phenomenon Task Force, a task force that was created at the behest of Congress, the legislative branch, by way of the Senate Intel Committee led by Marco Rubio. The UAP task force at this time was being led by Jay Stratton, a senior intelligence officer who I covered in parts 1 and 2, who was also a co-lead on the original UFO study program, OSAP, and hired the director for its successor, ATIP. Now, Jay Stratton, while he was running the Unidentified Aerial Phenomenon Task Force, recruited one of the most important players in the recent hearings to join him on his staff to gather and collate the existing UAP data across the military and the intelligence community. And guess who that person was? Dave Grush, the whistleblower from the hearing this week that testified that there is evidence that the US government is in possession of multiple spacecraft of non-human origin, as well as non-human biologics. Grush joined the military at age 18 as an Air Force intelligence officer and proceeded to join both the National Reconnaissance Office and the National Geospatial Agency. Now, it's important to understand the functions of these 2 agencies. The National Reconnaissance Office, the NRO, is responsible for the design, build, launch, and maintenance for all of our space-based and ground-based satellite systems for providing intelligence gathering services. The National Geospatial Agency, or the NGA, is responsible for collecting, analyzing, and distributing insights from the data collected from all geospatial systems. Now, this is interesting. While Dave Grush was at the NGA from 2016 until 2021, his primary job responsibility was as a senior technical advisor for unidentified aerial phenomenon and transmedium issues. And he was also responsible for providing the NRO's data that would be put into the presidential daily brief and hand-couriered it to the White House. This is a really key point here that illustrates the tension and conflict between the legislative and the executive branch about this issue, because between the years of 2017 and 2020, remember, in 2020 was the year that the Senate for the first time created legislation that was going to mandate the executive branch to give them a report on what they knew about this issue. But in 2016, the executive branch already had roles within the National Geospatial Agency, one of which David Grush was in the position of, that were actively studying this issue and that had satellite imagery that was capturing evidence of this phenomenon. But for whatever reason, the executive branch was not informing Congress of these incursions. And this is what drove Marco Rubio and Kirsten Gillibrand to create the UAP task force in the IAA, the Intelligence Authorization Act for 2021. So 2017 was the first time that Congress, in the legislative branch, first became aware of credible evidence in the possession of the executive branch of, at a minimum, a national security threat, the existence of these advanced technical vehicles that were flying around our military bases. In 2020, Congress created legislation in the IAA to create the UAP task force to force the executive branch to provide them that evidence. And then in 2021, the UAP task force, which was under the auspices of the Director of National Intelligence, created their preliminary report, which provided some high-level insights, but no actual hard evidence. Then in July of 2021, just 1 month after the UAP task force released their preliminary report, David Grush did something very interesting. He filed a reprisal complaint with the Department of Defense Inspector General. The role of inspectors general is basically to be the internal affairs for these federal agencies. So if someone's doing something illegal or wrong, they're the ones who investigate those issues. There are two main points to Dave Grush's whistleblower complaint to the DoD IG. One, that classified UAP data was being illegally withheld from Congress, and two, that he was being retaliated against for saying so. So how did we become aware of this information? From this document. And this document is not David Grush's July 2021 DoD IG complaint, which came out 1 month after the UAP Task Force preliminary report. This document is his second whistleblower complaint he filed in May of 2022 with the Intelligence Community Inspector General. And one of the major keys in this request from David Grush alongside his attorney, Irvin Charles McCullough III, is in Section 7, which requests that the ICIG forward David Grush's allegations and evidence to two committees in Congress in the legislative branch, the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, or the Senate Intelligence Committee, and the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, or the House Intelligence Committee. Fun fact, Irvin Charles McCullough III was the original Inspector General for the intelligence community under Obama. That role was created during the Obama administration. He was the first person to hold that position, and he is now representing David Grush in David Grush's own ICIG complaint about the executive branch withholding evidence of UAP from Congress. So Dave Grush files his ICIG complaint in May of 2022. Now, does anyone remember from part 2 what else was going on in May of 2022? Let's see if this jogs your memory.
And then finally, are you aware of a document that appeared around 2019, sometimes called the Admiral Wilson Memo or EW Notes Memo?
I am not.
You're not.
Are you trying?
I'm not personally aware of that.
This exchange between Republican Representative Mike Gallagher took place during the May 2022 UAP hearing, which would be the first in the recent series of 3 that we've seen. This exchange references a set of notes that were then written into the congressional record that alleges that the executive branch has been operating a crash retrieval and reverse engineering program for spacecraft of non-human origin. This was the first time the potential existence of spacecraft of non-human origin in the possession of the US government was officially added to the public record. It is extremely interesting that this event happened at the exact same time that Dave Grush was filing his whistleblower complaints alleging the exact same thing. Congress would continue to put pressure on the executive branch by requiring them to make the UAP task force a permanent office within DoD. As part of a mandate created by Congress as a part of the NDAA for 2022, the National Defense Authorization Act, a bill passed annually that funds the US military, the DoD was forced to create the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office. The new office, ARROW, would be set to replace an existing DoD office that they created in an effort to try to get ahead of congressional oversight called AIMSOG, the Airborne Object Identification and Management Group. As the UAP task force was set to expire, because within the government when you have a task force, they can only exist for a set period of time, the DoD tried to front-run the issue by creating AIMSOG, and Congress said, we're having none of that. Here's how you're going to do it. And it just so happens that the DoD announced this office in July of 2022. 2022 would also mark the end of the scientific and academic community's silence on this issue, as NASA announced a 16-person study panel specifically for UAP in October of 2022. The end of 2022 would turn out to be one of the most consequential turning points in this story, because the whistleblower complaint in possession of the ICIG was deemed credible and urgent in December, after the ICIG interviewed first-hand whistleblowers that David Grush interviewed and provided that information to the House and Senate Intel committees, as well as the Director of National Intelligence. This would mark the first time that Congress would become in possession of the evidence that the executive branch was withholding this information illegally of spacecraft of non-human origin. And we haven't even gotten to 2023 yet.